The Victorian Government is very pleased to partner with the Wheeler Centre to make this year's Deakin Lecture Series come to life. By the end of this week, 6,000 Victorians will have come to 10 events to discuss one of the most important issues facing the global community, climate change. Tonight's event dealing with the politics of climate change is something that is very near and dear to the hearts of Victorians. I myself have had thousands of conversations with our citizens about this very matter in the last couple of years, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you tonight. We are hoping that the discussion goes beyond rhetoric and looks at the practical action that we as a community can take to transform our economy and our industry to address climate change. We actually understand the importance of emissions trading, and as a government we have supported the commissioning of the important work by Ross Garnaut to lead to the design of emissions trading, and we continue to support its earliest implementation. We believe that it's very important for Victorians to have their say about this important issue and to be exposed to the world's best thinking about how we can rise up to this challenge. We are certainly hoping that tonight's Deakin event contributes to that work and enables better policy and action in the years to come.
Ours is a civilisation of ideas, and it has been that ever since the first human being 10,000 years ago took a wolf pup into the camp and realised that species could work together to create something that neither alone could achieve. And this Deakin Lecture Series is, for me, absolutely front and centre for the major concerns of our civilisation, because it's in great dialogues like this between world experts, between the audience taking the wisdom of crowds and our political leaders, that we hatch and then seek to grow the great ideas that will propel us into the future. In this Deakin Lecture Series we've had 32 presenters, experts from around the world to guide our thinking. We've heard from economists, business leaders, architects, investors, bankers, philosophers, even a few self-confessed polluters, as those who's been to earlier sessions will know, and of course a biologist. So we've had a pretty good run overall. But now it's the turn of the politicians. And like it or not, the focus really through the whole week has been on this issue of collective action that we mediate through our politics. How do we move forward? We've heard, I think, very clearly from our earlier speakers that the problem is not simply a technological one or an economic one. We already have the basis for moving forward. The problem is one of collective action, of actually taking the necessary steps that will put us on a trajectory towards a more sustainable future, and one which addresses this great issue of climate change. And I'd just like, in my few brief minutes, to highlight a couple of what I think the most important points made through this week are. We've heard from several speakers that Australia simply cannot achieve its stated goal of a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020, which represents about a 26% cut, incidentally, below business as usual emissions, without placing a price on carbon. We've heard other experts say that an emissions trading scheme is the most cost-effective manner in achieving those reductions. We've heard yet others say that in Europe, emissions trading schemes have been running now for 5 years, reducing emissions at the rate of 2 to 3% a year, and there has been no detectable impact on the economy of Europe overall. I think we see that we do have the basis for further action. The block, to me, is a political one, and how we move forward, and that's why I'm so much looking forward to this session. You know, how do we build upon the conditions we have in order to make sure that we can decisively move forward to address this great issue? Sure, the answers to that question are in the hands of the electorate as a whole, but they're particularly in the hands of our political leaders. And with that, I really just want to say no more than that it is over to you, our expert panel, and I look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you very much.
Can I begin by saying how delighted I am to have been asked to participate this evening in an issue which is very important for my government, both nationally and globally. And I've been asked to just say a little bit about the evolution of climate change policy and politics in the United Kingdom in 5 minutes, so I'll do my best. I think it's important for me to say at the outset that in the UK we don't believe that we have all the answers or that we have a perfect record. We know that tackling climate change is hard. It requires a total transformation of our economies over time, and we're all struggling with it. As you know, we've had a change of government recently, and we now have our first coalition government since the Second World War, and our Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said that he wants this government to be the greenest ever, both in terms of action at home and internationally. The coalition has promised to use a wide range of levers to cut carbon emissions, decarbonise the economy and support the creation of new jobs and green jobs and technologies. And they've already made some important policy announcements, including the cancellation of plans for a third runway at Heathrow, and there are other announcements which have also been made. In looking at our experience, I think that there are 6 key principles or themes which have characterised our approach to climate change. And the first, which is perhaps the most important, but all of them are important, is the broad consensus which exists around the need to tackle climate change and to move to a low-carbon economy. And I think it's worth remembering that the first world leader to call for action on climate change in a speech way back in 1989 was Margaret Thatcher. So it's not a left-right issue in the United Kingdom at all. And that consensus goes beyond the realm of our national party politics. Many business leaders and groups are outspoken advocates on the issue, with our major business body, the Confederation of British Industry, calling, and I quote, for an ambitious re-engineering of the economy in order to tackle climate change. Our corporate leaders group, made up of the CEOs of some of our global companies, pressing for transformational change. Trade unions, religious groups, civil society organisations have all been vocal. Local governments, not least in London, have set the pace in some respects. And our NGOs have been extremely effective in mobilising public support. There was a 3-year Big Ask campaign which played a key role in pressing for an ambitious Climate Change Act. And that campaign modelled itself on previous UK public campaigns for things like third world debt relief and making poverty history. And the public concern over climate change in the UK focuses not just on the domestic threat, but also the threat to the world's poorest people. So it's very much a bottom-up approach, and I can't really emphasise that too much. And there are lots of ways in which the politics has had to catch up with where the people are. The second thing which has been important has been continuity, and the efforts that we've made to enshrine the low-carbon transition into our institutional structures and into law. In 2008, we passed the Climate Change Act, which sets out the world's first ever legally binding targets for reducing emissions. It set 5-year carbon targets, with the government required to report progress to Parliament annually. The third thing which I think has been important are the efforts we've made to establish a sound empirical base for action. We have a climate research institute our Met office, the meteorological office at Hadley, they're two of the world's leading centres for climate change research. And we've also had a really important contribution on the economics of climate change from the Nick Stern review in 2006. And I think it's that combination of science and solid economics which has driven government policy, but it's also helped to build solid public support. People can see that there are real reasons to take action and that there's a solid research base for doing that. The fourth thing, which has been important, is ensuring that there's a recognition that the low-carbon transition isn't a threat to our economy, because, of course, people are concerned about the wages that they get, the long-term health and stability of the economy. So efforts to address climate change in Britain have gone hand in hand with economic growth. And even in the last couple of years, when we've had a pretty difficult time in terms of the global financial crisis, it's the low-carbon economy and, to a certain extent, green jobs in our economy which have helped to keep our economy moving. Between 1990 and 2005, the economy grew by more than 30%, while greenhouse gas emissions fell by more than 12%. The fifth thing is the comprehensive nature of the approach. A lot of people talk as if a price on carbon is all that's required. This is not our approach in the United Kingdom. We believe a carbon price is essential. We've had an emissions trading scheme since 2002, but it's not enough. Alone, a carbon price will not drive the transition fast enough, and it doesn't reach all parts of the economy equally effectively. You also need regulation, you need incentives, you need education, you need standards, and you need innovation. A modern economy is complex, and we have to use all the tools at our disposal. And finally, it's the commitment to action. I can see you, Nick, standing up. I said finally, so 30 seconds. And this really is important because we believe that what we all do really matters. It's actually quite rare in the United Kingdom to hear anyone say that we should wait and see what everyone else does, even though we account. It was worth it, I got a clap. Even though we account for less than 2% of the world's emissions, which is only slightly more than Australia. So there's a real sense that we have to take action, that everyone has a role to play. And I really look forward to the debate that we're going to have later. Thanks.
We live in a continent that is uniquely challenged by climate change. We live in a dry continent that is becoming drier and hotter in the southern part where most of the population live. And we have witnessed that. We have seen the last decade the hottest decade on record. The next hottest was the one before that, the next hottest the one before that. Climate change is real, it is affecting us now, and it is having a particularly severe impact on Australia. And yet, right now, we have every resource available to us to meet the challenge of climate change, except for one, and that is leadership. Our efforts to deal with climate change have been betrayed by a lack of leadership, a political cowardice, the like of which I have never seen in my lifetime before. The abandonment of the emissions trading scheme by the Prime Minister surely must be one of the most remarkable political acts, self-destructive political acts, I might say, there is some justice, that we've ever seen. Here was a man who came to office with a policy that he said was the answer to the greatest moral challenge of our times. Ultimately, he could not secure the support of the Senate. There was a change of leadership in the opposition. I remember it well. But oppositions can never be relied upon to support the government. That's why they're called the opposition. But he had the ability, and has the ability, to take the matter to a double dissolution. He has a constitutional means to resolve that deadlock. But because he did not want to take it on, because he did not have the guts to take on this issue, he squibbed it and abandoned it. And he wonders now why people ask, "What do you stand for, Kevin? What do you stand for, Kevin? What do you believe in? If you do not believe in action on climate change, what is the substance, the political substance of your leadership?" And the answer is, there is nothing there. We are in the absurd position of having a national government which has set an unconditional cut target of 5% from 2000 levels by 2020, but does not have the means to achieve it. It does not have the means to achieve it because it has cast those means away. And the surreal political aspect of this is that Kevin Rudd chose, out of cowardice, funk, as Tim Flannery described it, not to take on the emissions trading scheme for fear of being accused of imposing a great big new tax, notwithstanding that the emissions trading scheme had, on the basis of the latest Nielsen poll, the support of 58% of the population, had the support of the vast majority of industry, was well understood and had been consulted extensively with green papers, white papers, studies, amendments, negotiations. It was a well understood instrument for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and one which we knew would work. He squibbed that challenge and instead has gone off to pick a fight with his mining tax, which nobody understands, which nobody was consulted about, and which now has produced the most extraordinary political backlash we've seen in many years. It's an incredible, surreal episode of combination of political cowardice and political incompetence. Now, the fact is, the inconvenient, for some people, melancholy fact of life is this: we cannot cost-effectively achieve a substantial cut in emissions without putting a price on carbon. We have to put a price on carbon. We can do it via carbon tax, if you like. The better approach is via a cap-and-trade emissions trading scheme. I think most people in Australia who write about this agree on that. But you cannot get away from the fact that there is a cost. Now, the Coalition's new policy, unlike the government, which has no policy, it has a policy vacuum, the greatest policy vacuum to meet the greatest moral challenge, the Coalition has a new policy which amounts to the government, that's to say you, the taxpayers, paying for sufficient abatement in the form of offsets to meet the 5% target by 2020. I have to say, while it is not a policy I would propose or that I would regard as ideal, it does potentially or theoretically have the ability to meet the 5% target. It is a medium-term stopgap policy. That's probably the best way to describe it. What it doesn't do, of course, is set a long-term carbon price. It doesn't give the investors, people like Grant King from Origin, who spoke here earlier in the week, it doesn't give the investors and the business community the confidence, the signal that they need to know what kind of investment, what sort of equipment to buy, what sort of fuel to have to generate electricity in the years ahead. So the Coalition's policy, which I say is better than nothing, which is what the government has, is a medium-term stopgap which hopefully will be succeeded by a thoroughgoing price on carbon. If I could just conclude on this point, the proposition that the government has put out that nothing has been done internationally and that justifies us shelving the emissions trading scheme is flawed for two reasons. Firstly, the government has, and the coalition supports, an unconditional 5% cut. And if you make a commitment to that cut, it follows that you must have the means to carry it out. The government currently does not have the tools to do that. Perhaps Mark Dreyfus will tell us what they are. He might be able to produce them. But the second argument is that not enough has happened internationally. Well, Warwick McKibben, the member of the Reserve Bank Board and one of the most distinguished climate change economists in the world, has analysed the commitments made under the Copenhagen Accord. And he makes the point that the commitments that have already been made are very substantial. China's per capita emissions, on the basis of what it has committed to the Accord, will be 22% lower. The United States will be 33% lower. This is lower than business as usual. Ours, at a 5% cut, would be 35% lower. So there are substantial commitments that have been made, and of course the Europeans have made, as you know, very substantial commitments themselves already. So there is no reason, no political, moral, economic or ethical reason for this extraordinary abandonment of responsibility by the government. And what we have instead of leadership is cowardice. What we need to become truly a low-emission economy is courage and leadership. Thank you.
Well, we're at a very precarious time in the journey of our species on this planet, and certainly a very precarious time in the context of the journey of our civilisation on this planet. We really fundamentally have two choices before us as a species, as humanity. We can either descend into blame, into inaction, and ultimately, I believe, into conflict, or we can choose to be strong, to take strong action, to show leadership, to cooperate and collaborate, and foster the kind of innovation and the shared solutions at global, national, state and local level that we will need to see to address what I'm sure we would all agree is the preeminent public policy challenge facing humanity today. Now, I don't mean to get too parochial tonight, but that concept of collaboration and of cooperation has certainly implications in the current Tasmanian political context. We in Tasmania have just had a state election in March, and the Tasmanian people clearly chose to elect a lower house, the House of Government, with no one political party in majority. It was a 10-10-5 result. We've got a very small House of Assembly, which is a topic for another day certainly, but a 10-10-5 result, as I've said, it's about as well hung as a parliament can get. But I tell you, that result, delivered by the people, gave no one political party a mandate to put all of its policies into place, but it did deliver a mandate and in fact was a demand for cooperation and collaboration in the Tasmanian Parliament. Now, history shows that we now have two members of the Tasmanian Greens in the Cabinet in Tasmania, and I've got the honour to be the first Green Minister in the country's history, and I'm very proud and excited to have portfolio responsibility for climate change. By the way, I'm the first ever climate change minister in Tasmania. Previously, it wasn't considered worthy of a portfolio position on its own. And as Nick said, I also have responsibility for sustainable transport and alternative energy. And I'm determined to show the kind of leadership that we've heard Valerie and Malcolm speak about, and the kind of leadership we will undoubtedly need to address this preeminent public policy challenge. And I didn't work this out before with Valerie, but I also was going to mention Sir Humphrey and his penchant for saying to his minister, that is a very brave decision, Minister, meaning, of course, foolhardy. But people have said to me, oh, that's a brave decision to go into government, Nick, and I've said, yes, thank you. I hope you don't mean it as Sir Humphrey meant it, and I'll take it as a courageous decision. And it is a courageous decision, and quite frankly, I don't know how it's going to work out. But what I can tell you, it's working very well at the moment, and that kind of bravery or courage is what we will need in terms of all of our political leaders to deliver solutions to the climate change challenge. I'd like to make the blindingly obvious point here in that governments, and I talk about at a global level, national, state and local level, are running a long, long way behind public sentiment on this issue. It's an extraordinary situation. People want action, business and investors want certainty around climate policy, and governments, particularly in this country, have comprehensively failed to offer the kind of leadership that we will need. It's time for governments to lead from the front, not sit back, do very little, and expect people like you, people like me, and companies to show leadership on this issue. It's time that governments showed leadership on the area of climate change, and there are a couple of ways that governments can do it. Firstly, people in positions such as mine, leadership positions, can do things like this. We can come along today, show leadership, explain what we're doing, and I'll come to that in a minute, and the second thing that people in my position can do is actually implement strong public policy in this area. The third thing that we can do is use very careful language. We need to stop talking just about the crisis and start talking about the opportunities. We need to stop focusing on the nightmare and start focusing on the dream, because there are opportunities available to early adapters, whether it's at a local, even a household, a state or a national level. Strong action now will place us in a stronger position to deliver on the kinds of things that people expect governments to deliver. We need to not only look at mitigation, although that is indeed a crucial part of the public policy solution, but I have a view that even if we took strong action at a global level right now to make significant inroads into our global emissions profile, we're still going to need to look at adaptation measures in order to get through the worst impacts of climate change. And adaptation is going to require some long-term thinking. It's going to require thinking about pretty much every aspect of the way we live our lives today, whether it's power generation, how we move people around, how we work, how we move freight around, how we plan for the future. All of those things are going to need to be considered in the context of what I believe will be some inevitable impact. And we can argue about how strong and how difficult the impacts will be, but I believe there are going to be impacts. So we need to look at our planning systems. Are you waving that prior to standing up, Nick? You are, aren't you? I'm about to say finally in a minute. But I do want to say the way we plan our infrastructure is crucial. I mean, how crazy is it that we are spending by a factor of 10 or 100 more on building roads than we are on passenger transport? And those roads, we're going to turn around and mine them in 100 years for their oil content. These are the kind of long-term solutions that we need. But I just want to quickly say to you that you all absolutely have a role to play, and you can play your role in driving good public policy in this area. You all have a vote, you all have a voice. And what I want to say to you, and I want to leave you with this thought: demand strong leadership from your political representatives. If people won't lead, vote them out. If people aren't taking strong enough action, ring them up and tell them, and then if they don't, vote them out. You have the power here. We represent you. exercise that power thoughtfully, but above all, make sure you exercise it strongly. If you do that, you will get political leadership that will lead and not follow.
I was very pleased to learn that I share something in common, at least with Alfred Deakin, which is that occasionally I cycle to work, particularly in Canberra. The four presentations we've just had show us just how hard and indeed new the politics of climate change are. They've been with us for about 20 years, probably dating from Margaret Thatcher being the first international leader to call for some action on climate change. They are diabolically difficult. You've heard that from every speaker here, and you'll go on hearing it, and I suspect it will be with us for the rest of the lives of everybody in this room. Just in the last 3 years in Australia, after more than a decade of inaction, we've had the importance of the politics of climate change demonstrated on many occasions. It led to the change of government. It's led to the change of leadership in the coalition 3 times. John Howard, Brendan Nelson and my parliamentary colleague Malcolm Turnbull have all met their end in one way or another because of the politics of climate change. And sometimes those politics have favoured those who favour action. At other times the politics has, at least in the short term, favoured those who argue that climate change is just absolute crap. And there are 2 approaches we can take to analysing this. We could revisit history, we could go and look at who was right or wrong, or we can try to fairly examine, in the Australian context, how we got to where we are, and with a view to understanding what now needs to be done. What now needs to be done to deliver the outcome on climate change that I would suspect that everybody in this room would be hoping for. And I think it's worth mentioning that those are the options. Go back over the past, or indeed look at how we've got to where we are now with a view to looking at what is to be done. And I would say that the starting point, because we have to work within the parliamentary system, the starting point is to examine what happened in the Australian Parliament. Large-scale constitutional change does seem a very long way off, and for that reason, starting with what has happened under the system we now have needs to be looked at. I'm disappointed in the presentation that Malcolm Turnbull has just given you because it was rhetoric. We had not one suggestion from my parliamentary colleague who led the opposition until he met his parliamentary demise, his leadership demise. We had not one suggestion as to what is to happen now, what he is going to do in his party room, a majority of whom support an extraordinary position of virtually no action on climate change. So I simply want to look first at what's happened since 2007, just to remind people. After ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, the government spent 2 years developing the Green Paper, further time developing the White Paper, the Treasury undertook significant economic modelling, and the government drafted comprehensive legislation which underpins the CPRS. That legislation was passed by the House of Representatives. Indeed, it's been passed on 3 occasions. The government undertook lengthy negotiations with the opposition to ensure bipartisan support for the legislation, and indeed we achieved that bipartisan support. Malcolm Turnbull, I would accept, has been a strong advocate for action. He worked very hard to achieve passage of the carbon pollution reduction scheme, but a majority of the party that he now serves with would apparently go to any length to avoid action on climate change. The majority of the Liberal Party takes this view. It's expressed by Nick McKim, and I quote, "For the extreme left, it provides the opportunity to do what they've always wanted to do, to sort of deindustrialise the Western world. You know, the collapse of communism was a disaster for the left, and really they embraced environmentalism as their new religion." That's Nick McKim. And I'd say for the colleagues of Mr McKim, Mr McKim, of course, has proved himself a very constructive participant in government decision-making, but his Greens colleagues in the Australian Senate took a different view. And when the Liberal senators Judith Troth and Sue Boyce crossed the floor to vote with the government for the CPRS on the 3rd of December last year, that's the deal on the CPRS struck by my parliamentary colleague Mr Turnbull and the government, the legislation failed by 5 votes. And that is precisely, you'll have your chance in questions later, that is precisely the number of Greens in the Senate, 5 votes. In other words, if the Greens had done what every other Greens party in the world had done and voted for emissions trading, Australia would now have an emissions trading scheme. Every other Greens party has voted for emissions trading, even though those schemes were more compromised and less comprehensive than Australia's. And what we've had is the Greens putting perceived political party advantage ahead of action on climate change. As I said, you'll get a chance in questions. I wanted to end with some suggestions for how to deal with this in the future and to do more than simply express rhetorical flourishes, which is what we've heard from Malcolm Turnbull. It's not true that the government does not have a plan, and it is not true that the government has not taken action. Just for starters, we have legislated for a renewable energy target, and that renewable energy target legislation is back again in the Senate this week. And that would be the call for action that I would make. But I wanted to end with some direct suggestions, some of which are similar to those that Nick McKim has expressed and some of which are similar to those Valerie Amos has expressed. I think there are some things to avoid. We need to avoid concentrating on the negatives of climate change and instead look at positive outcomes like energy security and energy efficiency and sustainability. We need to avoid making the perfect the enemy of the good. We need to avoid assuming that there is only one answer, because there are many. The Low Carbon Growth Plan of McKinsey shows that there are many possibilities. We need to avoid thinking that it is ever too late to act, and we need to avoid taking temporary party political advantage which damages the prospect of long-term action. Those outside the Parliament, I would suggest, need to act in a way which adds to the consensus for action on climate change. Preaching to the converted will not do it. We need to ask for those outside the Parliament to advocate and urge action in a way which leads to change within the Parliament. And I'll end on the call to action because it's current. The renewable energy target legislation is in the Senate in this sitting fortnight. The renewable energy target legislation will increase the amount of renewable energy used in Australia by 4 times over the next decade. I note that neither the Liberals nor the Greens have said that they will support this legislation. This is an opportunity, a real opportunity for legislative consensus to be reached, and I would call on every single person here to contact senators to urge them, particularly senators in the Greens Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party, to ask them to pass this legislation. Thank you.
And the first question is to Malcolm Turnbull from Helen. Helen, I don't have your surname. Hopefully you know you are Helen. And Malcolm, have you considered joining the Greens or Labour so you can achieve something meaningful on climate change?
Well, the answer is neither has invited me, but if they did, I would thank them for the flattering invitation and decline. No, my commitment is to the Liberal Party. The emissions trading scheme was, of course, a policy of the Liberal Party in government. It was John Howard's policy. We took it to the 2007 election. It is a market-based policy, which a free market party would normally be inclined to support, and I will continue to work for effective action on climate change and market-based policies within the Liberal Party.
Thank you. I won't ask anybody else to comment on that question. The next question is from Clive Parrott, and although he says to all panel members, I may just focus on a couple of you, just so that we can keep the next 30 minutes or so moving. And Clive states that Australia is a world leader in the production and export of greenhouse gases. Why can't we become a world leader in the reduction of greenhouse gases instead of waiting to see what everybody else is doing? Nick, you might just want to offer a perspective, and then after you, I'm going to go to Mark. Nick.
Well, thanks, Nick. Look, there's no doubt that we should be looking at being global leaders. I can't help again but going to the Tasmanian context. Just a couple of very quick points to make. Tasmania has a very deeply held environmental awareness amongst our people, caused by long and deeply held and at times fractious environmental debates. We have the highest per capita number of scientists in Australia. Choice magazine a few years ago said that Tasmanians factor in the energy rating systems on white goods to a greater degree than anyone else. And I mention those things because they are natural competitive advantages, if you like, for Tasmania, and a reason why it should, in fact, be easier for Tasmania to make the strong shift that we need. And I think in the global context, Australia also shares a number of those competitive advantages. Look, we've got to aim high. This is, as we would all agree, the preeminent public policy challenge facing humanity today, and Australia should be looking at being a global leader instead of the global laggard that we currently are.
Thank you, Nick. Mark, instead of waiting to see what everybody else is doing, what should we be doing?
And the question went to what is going to happen, whether Australia should be a world leader in carbon emission cuts, rather than our present position, which is as a world leader in carbon emissions production. I've got every confidence that Australia is going to get to be in a position of being a world leader in carbon emissions cuts. We have immense natural advantages, and I suppose one of the things I'd want to observe, and this goes to why the politics of climate change are so difficult in Australia, is that we had a long period of inaction. I'm sorry if that sounds partisan, but I was struck when Valerie Amos came to our country last October to take up her post as High Commissioner. Valerie very publicly made some comments about the nature of the debate that we were having in Australia last November. And what occurred to me at the time was that one of the reasons we were still having the debate and still hadn't reached the consensus that has been reached in the United Kingdom, which Valerie spoke of tonight, is because we didn't do anything at all at the national governmental level between 1996 and 2007. For all that Malcolm might now wish to say that the Liberal Party took emissions trading to the last election as a policy, the Liberal government didn't do anything. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do. Being an optimist about the future of this country, I think we will get there. We will be world leaders in emissions cuts. We've got plenty of natural advantages. We've got the science, and we will get there.
Malcolm, did you want to comment?
Look, I think Mark can reasonably or fairly complain that more could have been done from 1996 to 2007, but it's just not fair to say that nothing was done. There are a whole range of programs that were undertaken that did have the impact of cutting our emissions from where they would have otherwise been. And the conclusion was that they were not going to get us to a significant cut in greenhouse gas emissions unless we put a price on carbon emissions. Hence, in 2006, we set up the Shergold Committee that ultimately designed the ETS. But, you know, the terrible tragedy, policy tragedy we face at the moment is this, that in the absence of any new policy, and I'm assuming that the extended renewable energy target is passed and operates, accepting all of that happens, in the absence of something new, our emissions in 2020 will be 121% of where they were in 2000 instead of 95%, which is where both the government and the opposition are committed to having them. So, you know, there is a bipartisan commitment to an emissions reduction objective, but there is not an instrument put forward by the government, a policy put forward by the government that is capable of achieving that objective.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'm very keen not to make this like Q&A, where you have a former Liberal minister and a current Labor representative taking up around about 70% of the programme. So bear that in mind if I'm a little bit rude to some, OK? The young gentleman, definitely young gentleman, younger than me anyway, on the microphone at the back. If you could say your name, please.
It's Matthew Wright, Executive Director of Beyond Zero Emissions. And look, my question is to Malcolm. I know you're very fond of emissions trading schemes, and I'm personally agnostic on mechanisms as long as there's the real imperative to do something with them. Yeah. And what I'd like to know is your opinion on using feed-in tariffs or upfront mechanisms to actually drive the cost reduction trajectory that drive the cost reduction curve for renewables so that you get the price down. So where we've seen that happen is in the German, Spanish and Chinese situation, where the cost of solar photovoltaic has dropped by half in the last 18 months, and the cost of solar thermal with storage, which is that base load solar power, has dropped to half in the last 24 months from the money that was put up the front. Now, the alternative with a plain ETS...
Thanks, Matthew. I think we've got the question. Malcolm?
Okay. Matthew, you raise a very good point. If you have a feed-in tariff, for example, in New South Wales, if you have solar panels on your roof, the electricity company will buy that electricity back from you for around 66 cents a kilowatt hour, which is obviously vastly more than the retail price, multiple, probably 4 or 5 times more than the retail price. So that is a subsidy. And what that is doing is, in effect, obliging all the other customers of the electricity retailer to subsidise those solar panels. You have to distinguish in policy between seeking to cut greenhouse gas emissions, in which case your objective should be to cut as much emission at the lowest possible cost, and on the other hand, seeking to develop particular industries. Now, the justification for solar panel rebates or feed-in tariffs is not that it cuts emissions cost effectively, because it doesn't. The Auditor General did a study on our photovoltaic rebate policy when we were in government and concluded it was cutting emissions at about $450 a tonne, which is very high, obviously.
But if it causes
but just let me go on. So the argument, the justification, is one of industry development. So the punt that you are taking, and look, I doubled the photovoltaic rebate when I was the minister, so I'm with you on the strategy. But the punt that you are taking is that by heavily subsidising this particular industry, in this case photovoltaic solar cells, you will over time see their cost come down to a point where they become cost competitive. But you've got to remember there are 2 objectives. Your industry development, with the hope that the industry will become genuinely competitive, versus cutting emissions at least cost.
Nick,
thank you, Malcolm. I was actually going to think of throwing to you, Valerie, because of course that is quite a major policy that was announced by Ed Miliband just prior to the last election. If you just want to say a little bit about the approach to feed-in tariffs in the UK, was that what you were going to say?
I was just going to add that the investment in innovation is absolutely critical. And one of the things that is important is that government does have to subsidise at an early stage some of that innovation, because the banks don't necessarily do it. But if you're going to have a mix in the economy and move more towards renewables, you need that initial investment.
Thank you. There's a gentleman with a yellow T-shirt, but I know you've asked at least 2 questions through the series. Are you okay with the woman behind you making it? Come along, make your way.
Thank you so much again, Nick. Thank you so much, everybody. I have a very, very important question. And excuse me, after this I need to go to other conference. I not make a statement. These are what solution you have for bushfire and drought? How can we broken this cycle of nature disaster happen in the past, happening in the present, and will happen in the future? I remind you, we need action, we need practical for this serious problem. We need money, we need mind, and we need international wisdom.
Thank you. I think, Leon, thank you very much. Nick, would you just like to respond very quickly?
Bushfire and drought.
Yep.
I'm not sure my powers extend far enough, even as a minister, to take care of bushfire and drought. Look, it ultimately goes to mitigation and adaptation, and particularly around fire risk. I'd have to say there's a lot that we can do in terms of planning and the way we manage land that we're going to need to have a good think about and put good policy in position to deal with. I just want to deal with a little bit of a furphy that comes up that somehow the Greens in in our policy positions in relation to creations of national parks and other reserves are somehow putting lives and property at risk. I've heard that many times. In fact, the good Senator, your colleague Malcolm Erica Betts, is out in the media regularly in Tasmania accusing us of things like this. Look, if an area of land is reserved at whatever status, if a proper management assessment finds that that area needs managing in order to provide good outcomes or to provide for community safety, that's absolutely fine with us. That's been our policy all along.
Thank you, Nick. I won't go to any other members of the panel. I want to kind of speed things up a little bit. There's a woman who I'd like to ask a question here. She's been, I think, to, if not all, then most of the lectures, so she should get some award for that. She should certainly get a question. I'd like you to ask a question, and then I'd like to go to the gentleman with the beard, and then I'd like to go to the panel on those two questions. So your name?
Cheryl Kerr from King Island. Thank you for an extraordinary week of wonderful lectures, and I hope we can repay your generosity in some small way by utilising this information. The question: how can we involve every man, woman and child in this country in the enormous task ahead to change our thinking in terms of what we need as opposed to what we want or think we want as a result of the continuous bombardment of commercial brainwashing that leads to the excess and massive waste we see around us? In a future carbon economy, can we follow the British example to encourage the consumer to think in terms of carbon dollars, perhaps, with product labelling that includes a traceable carbon cost and sustainable production practices? And just a small point, when we came to Melbourne last week, we bought 2 litres of milk and 1 carton of eggs. 1 litre of milk and the carton of eggs were from Brisbane. The other litre was from New South Wales. Now, what is the carbon cost there? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Right. This is to you, Tim. Tim, do you think that...
Sorry, your name?
Roger Taylor. Do you think that by concentrating the discussion on climate change almost exclusively and in terms of solutions in terms of greenhouse gases, you're ignoring the other more broadly based concerns of global change, such as resource depletion, degradation of our natural systems, species loss? We ignore the drivers of all of these issues, of which climate change is but one, and the underlying drivers are population growth and our lifestyles, which are no longer sustainable. That unless we focus more generally on these drivers, that we are bound to oversimplify the problem, and that we may, in fact, be kidding ourselves, and that all this discussion will be no more than a charade.
Thank you, Roger. Valerie, you alluded to it a little bit in your comments earlier about the Big Ask campaign and also some of the work that the British government had done in relation to climate change. But I wonder if you'd like to comment a little bit on the role of the consumer, about informing the consumer about the impact that they can have on the problem.
I think it's really important that we help people to make the kinds of decisions they want to make. I think that people will make the decisions about changing their lives over a period of time. I think it's really important that people don't feel that they're being forced to do... we don't all want to make decisions immediately about changing the way we live our lives, and I think it's really important that people are able to make that choice and have the information that enables them to make that choice. And some of that is about giving them information that helps them to make those choices about what they buy, but also about how they can change their lifestyle and things that they can do to make a difference. Too much of the debate is at a level which makes it seem impossible, and so people give up.
Thank you. And then I'd just like to go to Mark, and then Nick, and then Tim, if you could respond to the question from the gentleman at the back. Mark.
Yes, I'm going to try to respond to both questions at once because they raise the same issue about the rate of change. We know the rate of change to be increasing in our society, but we are not about to have a complete revolution in the industrial base of our society overnight. We've built up the industrial base of this society over 100 or 200 years, depending on how you want to look at economic processes. And what's striking to me is that the kind of comments that are being made in this room, the kind of comments that both questions rested on, the ideas that both comments rest on, which is thinking about how we live, thinking about carbon footprint, thinking about why the milk came from Brisbane and the eggs came from an equally long distance away. All of those are very new thoughts. They are ideas that happily have increasing currency in our society, and I think certainly what governments can do is to encourage information, encourage more explanation about the science. Certainly I've been working on getting climate scientists to go to Parliament House so that parliamentarians are better informed about all of these matters. I'm quite encouraged about the possibility of change in the way people live and in the way people think about things like carbon footprints and carbon consequences.
Thank you, Mark. Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Look, just firstly in relation to the labelling, I mean, yes, informed consumers are powerful consumers, and I'd absolutely support some of the suggestions being made. But I did want to respond to the question that was asked over there, because I absolutely accept the premise of the question. I mean, climate change is just one of a series of global policy challenges facing us. You spoke about population, and there's a key and obvious link with climate change there. And biodiversity loss is another one that's right at the top of my mind, and obviously a link between climate change, population and biodiversity loss. And it's a really interesting public policy question, really. Do you pursue a somewhat narrow public policy focus of just climate change and then roll out what you learn and how you respond to climate change, including a cost on carbon? Do you then roll out those public policy parameters to deal with other issues, or do you try to deal with all of the issues at once? And I have to confess my thinking's changed a little bit on this. I've previously been an advocate of, look, we've got to address all of these things in one big public policy shift, but having seen how poorly we're responding to climate change at a global level, my optimism that we could actually do that within a timely way is a lot less than it used to be. So I now have a personal view that we should be trying everything we can to deliver good public policy solutions on climate change, because that is the pressing issue, although, as I said, not the only one, and then roll out the public policy solutions we've developed around climate change, including putting a strong cost on carbon to deal with some of those other issues. But it's a very vexed question, and I'm not certain that I have the right or all the answers there.
Tim.
Look, I do need to defend my curatorial decision, I guess, to label the series Innovating in the Face of Climate Change. And just to say that if you'd been here through the week, you would have heard Tim Jackson give a lecture which is arguably our most popular lecture for the series, where he argued for the decoupling of prosperity and growth, which is very much going towards the issues that you're talking about. I was very keen to have our Indian colleagues speak, because for them, addressing climate change and dealing with this affluence and prosperity issue and the aspirations of people are absolutely front and centre. We heard Kartikeya Sarapai say last night that in India, over the next 14 months, they will add the population of Australia to their country. It's simply not an option for them to aspire to a level of affluence that we have in this country. But having said that, it is absolutely essential that we deal with this very urgent problem of emissions reduction in this country. We heard Grant King explain on the second night of this series that if we wait till 2013 to implement a carbon price in this country, we will have lost the opportunity to make that 5% emission reduction. And that's because the investments that are required in new infrastructure have very long lead times. By 2013, the decisions are going to be made. So it is very valid in my mind to keep our focus on that urgent issue, that urgent problem, at the same time that we start scoping out these bigger questions, which you quite rightly pointed to.
Thank you, Tim. We've got 10 more minutes of questions before we go over to Tim to sum up, and then to Chrissy from the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to take a question from the woman down here first, and then the gentleman by the microphone at the back. And I'd also like to thank the woman down here who was in front to let the woman who was behind stand up, because you've already asked 2 questions. So, your name?
Karen Alexander, and I'm from the Victoria Naturally Alliance. Victoria Naturally Alliance is 9 environment groups here in, who got together to look at the biodiversity crisis in Victoria. It seems to be the era of crises. There's a global change, obviously climate change crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis, which is much harder, I think, for people to understand. And Tim may have talked about this in previous lectures, but I haven't been able to be here, unfortunately.
A question.
The question is, these two crises do not seem to be very well linked, and yet it's clear that clearing and planting is a major way of helping to both reduce emissions and also to address the sequestration and putting back of biodiversity. It's a very simple question, and I'd like a yes from each of the party political people. I don't think that either of the parties, and Tim, Nick's got a big issue with forestry in Tasmania, actually managed to bring these two issues together. And I want a yes from each of you that you will actively pursue the ways of bringing those two issues together. And if you need some expert advice, I'm not claiming to have it, Tim would have it, but I can certainly find you that thing so that we can come to you, I can come to you after this meeting or at a later stage to push through your parties the things that will help to address both those crises.
Thank you. I think all you can really ask for is an answer, and I think we should allow them the answer yes, maybe or no. And I'm quite happy to go from this side of the stage to the other.
I'm very happy to give a yes.
Yes.
Because we're already there. We know.
No, but we only want one word. So okay. Yes. Nick?
Yes. Yes, I think everyone is committed to
Valerie, don't
promoting biodiversity. I can assure you.
I can't say anything.
I know, good. Tim?
I'm going to take the curator's privilege to answer properly and just say that unless you're committed to actually addressing this issue, you don't have a viable climate policy. And I take the state of Victoria as an example of that. This state still allows old-growth logging of the most carbon-dense forests on the planet. You just can't have a viable policy with that sort of thing in place.
Gentleman at the back, your name.
YP Chan. Tim, thank you very much for this wonderful occasion and on this important subject of climate change. You managed to get yourself, what I want to say is that but you are preaching to the converted. This group, the John Howard so-called lefty loonies, are your converted flock, so to speak. But you managed to, I think you managed to get yourself belted by Andrew Bolt yesterday. I think it's done a lot of damage to your credibility. I hope there is a rebuttal coming from you someday soon. But
can we have a question?
My question is to Malcolm Turnbull.
Oh.
Team.
At least it's someone on the stage. I like that.
Team Flannery, a few days ago, said he didn't want skeptics in this forum. Or, sorry, in this panel. He didn't want any skeptics in this panel. All he wanted was solutions, conversation, so we can move forward. Well, Malcolm, in your 5 minutes this evening, you spent nearly 4 minutes.
Can we have a question to Malcolm Turnbull?
Yes, yep. Lambasting Kevin Rudd, and I thought I was in the election rally. My question to you is, when you become the opposition leader after the election, will you, given that Minchin won't be there after the election, will you take on the ETS and support the government in passing it through Parliament?
Well, thank you. Well, that's the ultimately hypothetical question, although it's very flattering. But, well, look, I think everybody knows where I stand on this issue. I'm committed to effective action on climate change. I don't... Look, an emissions trading scheme, can I just say this about an ETS? It is just a piece of economic plumbing. You know, there are a number of ways you can transform an economy over time to a lower emission economy. You can do it with a carbon tax, you can do it with regulation, you could theoretically even do it on the basis of the government picking up the tab completely. It's not very efficient though. The question is, how do you do it cost effectively? And I believe a cap and trade scheme is the most efficient. But you've got to get on and do it. What we need is action. We've got to stop the excuses and we have to act. And right now we are facing, and I'm sorry if I've spent 4 minutes criticising Kevin Rudd. He's always said such nice things about me. But can I just say this? The fact is, and this is the thing that we've got to remember, we are living in a country which does not have an effective climate change policy at all. We are living in a country whose Prime Minister has said climate's the greatest moral challenge of our time and we're going to cut our emissions by 5%, but there is no policy that the government has capable of achieving that. I have never seen a policy vacuum like this in my life.
OK, thanks, Malcolm. We've heard that. Now, can we have 2 final questions from the floor? I'm really sorry. I know this could go on for a long time. It's Saturday evening. We said we'd finish at 7 o'clock. We may not. If we don't, it's not going to be very much after 7 o'clock. So I'm only going to take 2 more questions. So all of you there, I'm really sorry. But get onto the website, throw the questions in, and hopefully there may be some answers that come back. I know that a number of members of the panels and both the lecturers through the Deakin Lecture Series have been very kind enough to actually say that they will be responding to the questions as they go up on to the website. So I'm really sorry, but I have to keep to time. I'd like to go to the gentleman at the back first, and you articulate your question, then we'll get a question from the lady at the front, and then we'll go to the panel, and then I'll say a few words, and then we'll go to Tim. The gentleman at the back, your name, please.
Jonathan Upson. My question is, do you think the Rudd government's carbon pollution reduction scheme was designed with the objective to be the most efficient and effective carbon reduction scheme, or was it designed to be a very effective wedge into the opposition, which ended up being the result?
Thank you. The lady at the front.
Jane Morton from the Climate Emergency Network. A related question. Given that Garnaut said that a carbon tax is better than a heavily compromised ETS like the CPRS, do you personally support the Garnaut interim carbon tax proposed by the Greens? And in your personal opinion, how do you think it compares with the CPRS? That's for Tim, Malcolm and Mark.
I was going to ask for a one-word answer from Nick McKim, actually. He could just say yes. But let's respect the questioner. If they're both questions related to the CPRS, we might take them both together. The first question was about efficient and effective versus something that had some political purpose behind it, and then the value or otherwise of the proposal that's come forward from the Greens based on Ross Garnaut's position. Mark, you might want to kick off.
Well, I'll go back to what I said in my remarks about the carbon pollution reduction scheme. This is a matter of the way in which the Parliament operates, and in order to get the carbon pollution reduction scheme through the Parliament, we had 2 choices. We could look for the support of the Greens, who would have had to have brought with them 2 other senators who could have been Liberals and were in fact at the end of the day Liberals, or Senators Xenophon and Fielding. Alternatively, we could choose, and we did choose to do this, negotiate with the Liberal and National parties to achieve their support for a scheme, because I say to all of you, something is better than nothing, and nothing is where we are as a result of the failure of the bipartisan agreement and the failure of the Greens to vote with the 2 Liberal senators who crossed the floor. And I'm going to answer the interjection, which we've heard often, that we did not negotiate with the Greens. The Greens needed to come and say we can deliver a majority on the floor of the Senate, which they were never able to do. It is ultimately about parliamentary politics. And as to the suggestion that, as to the question about whether or not a cap and trade scheme is better than simply a tax, we favour a cap and trade scheme because it actually imposes a cap. It puts a limit on emissions, and that's what we think is essential to a scheme.
Malcolm, do you want to go next?
Well, look, I don't think there's any doubt that Kevin Rudd did use the CPRS as a wedge against the coalition. And having said that, though, to be scrupulously fair, the CPRS was an evolution from the emissions trading scheme that was being designed under the Howard government. And Martin Parkinson, who's head of the Department of Climate Change, you've heard from in this series, was put in that job under the Howard government. So there was, quite a continuum, a continuation of policy development between the Howard and the Rudd government. So, as I said in the House, the CPRS owes as much to John Howard as it does to Kevin Rudd. On the question of carbon tax versus emissions trading scheme, it really boils down to this. The argument in favour of a tax is that it's simpler. There's a dollar amount, $25 a tonne, whatever it is. But while the price is certain, the level of emissions is not. The virtue of a cap and trade is that you set a cap on emissions, so you know your emissions are going to be no more than the permitted amount, but what you don't know is what the price will be. And so generally, the general view around the world, and it's been the experience, and I think some of your speakers have said this, Tim, at this series, is that the emissions trading scheme approach has been preferred. But they both put a price on carbon. They're both market-based solutions. They both have merit. You can make a case for either. I think the ETS is a better approach, but a tax would be better than nothing.
Tim, do you just want to say a brief word, because I know you get the chance at the last word, and then I'll go to Valerie. Tim.
Very, very briefly. Just look.
I'm sorry, I've forgotten yet. Well,
could I just... Garneau's point was that if there's a failure at Copenhagen, we should produce an interim carbon tax until we can get things sorted out. I don't think there was a failure at Copenhagen. There's been a failure of domestic politics, and I guess I'd say let's have an interim carbon tax until we can get that sorted out, if it looks like it's going to be a long process.
Yep.
But I just wish people were here to hear Danny Ellerman, the MIT economist, speak about the merits of an emissions trading scheme versus a carbon tax. There are numerous aspects of a carbon trading scheme that make it more efficient and more certain that you get your reductions.
Valerie.
I want to say two quick things, if I may. One is about Copenhagen and post-Copenhagen. There's no doubt we had huge ambitions for Copenhagen, all of which were not realised. It would be wrong, however, to think that it was a complete failure. We've got 80 countries that have already signed up to ambitious targets as a result of what was agreed at Copenhagen, and we just need to recognise that, because there's a degree of dynamism that has come out of that process that we don't want to lose sight of over the next few months and years. The second thing is just to go back to something that I said in my remarks, which is, of course, the debate here at the moment is about, tax or an emissions trading scheme, what's the best thing to use. It's really important to remember that in a complex economy like Australia, and this is what we found out in the United Kingdom, you need a mix of solutions. It's not just about one thing or another. So it's good to have the debate about, do you want a tax or do you want an emissions trading scheme? But regulation, innovation, what you do in terms of the kinds of investments you make into renewables all have a role to play.
Thank you very much, Valerie. As I said, there are many, many more questions that we could ask. We could keep this session going on for a long time. But I feel I have to draw things to a close with just a few words to say that it's been an absolute pleasure for me to act as a moderator, working again very closely with Tim, as I have over quite a lengthy period. And it's been a real delight working with the whole team at the Wheeler Centre. And no matter how well or incompetently occasionally I might have done my job, I should also thank Matthew Sander, who works with me at Kinesis in Sydney, because he's been a great help over the last months in helping put this together. Nick Stern, when asked to describe the climate problem, called it a multidisciplinary, international, intertemporal, collective action problem under uncertainty. It's a really, really hard problem, and in putting this whole Deakin lecture series together, Tim and I wanted breadth but also depth, and I think we've achieved that. I think that we've had the breadth of perspectives on a whole different series of elements of this problem, and we've had the depth of some of the very, very best minds and best practitioners looking to achieve those emissions reductions that we so desperately need. And I never like ill-defined we's, but when I say we, I mean we as in everybody in this hall, and indeed everybody in Melbourne and everybody beyond Melbourne. We need those emissions reductions. With that, I will step aside and ask Tim Flannery to both say the last word and to thank our panel. Tim.
In the Republic, Plato sets forth an evolution of political structures for humanity. And the final three in that evolution are what he calls a timocracy, which is a sort of an oligarchy of power. And then he goes on to what he calls his imperfect forms of government, included among which a democracy. And he then says, but of course all of these imperfect forms of government ultimately lead to tyranny. If we could reverse Plato's structure and evolution and establish the timocracy as coming out of democracy, and I were the Tim, we may have a very different set of outcomes because I could simply dictate the sort of solutions I'd like. Unfortunately, that's not the position we're in. We've had a week of extraordinarily rich debate and discourse around this critically important issue, and you, audience, have been a very, very important part of that. And could I just thank those who have persisted night after night coming to this lecture series, and thank you in particular. You've been a backbone for us of this series, very much as Nick, our moderator, has been an absolutely essential backbone from the beginning to the end of the series. But we've come tonight at the pointy end of things. We've come to this issue of collective action, how we work together. I don't want to finish by commenting on the politics of the issue. What I'd like to do instead is talk about the quality of the people we have on the platform in front of us. It has been extraordinarily hard for many of those people to come here this evening and effectively bear themselves to 3 television studios, to the public of Australia and to you as an audience. And the reason for that is that many of them are caught in the classic political dilemma of loyalty to a party, and yet that party not entirely reflecting what your strongly held personal views might be. Before we came up on the platform, however, I observed our panellists downstairs in the green room talking very honestly, very clearly and very constructively to each other about this issue. And I'd just like to finish this panel session by asking you to join me in wishing them well in the future as they grapple with this problem. It's not a problem caused by human evil as such. It is a problem that can be resolved by us working together. So could I just ask you to put your hands together to thank our panellists on this final evening.